The screen is black. A faint, distorted hum lingers in the background, like the echo of voices buried under centuries of dirt. They told you that the wild frontiers of America were built by grit, by family, by faith. But what if I told you that in the mountains of Colorado, in the year 1882, a family carried a bloodline so tainted, so cursed, that its very existence was scrubbed from history books? The Whitaker Clan. A name whispered only in fragments of rumor, never written in polite society, never taught in classrooms. It begins not with land or gold, but with blood. Blood turned inward, folded on itself, tightened like a noose around the neck of generations. You see, the Whitakers believed in purity, not the kind preached in churches, but the kind whispered in dark rooms when the lamps burned low. Their curse was not an accident of nature. It was chosen, cultivated, refined across decades, until the line itself bent into something unrecognizable. In the winter of 1882, a Colorado sheriff stumbled upon their cabin while tracking a missing miner. He found no miner. What he found instead was a family that looked less like the product of chance and more like the grotesque offspring of a secret experiment. Children with faces too similar, voices that stammered in unison, bodies marked by deformities that could not be explained away by frontier hardship. They should have been pitied. Instead, they were feared. But here is what no one will tell you. The Whitakers were not unique. They were not a freak accident lost in the snowbound mountains. They were part of a pattern, an unspoken undercurrent running through the veins of America, one tied to ancient beliefs about blood, heredity, and control. These families were hidden, shielded by the silence of institutions that did not want you asking questions. Tonight, you will hear the story of the Whitaker clan. But be warned. Once you know it, you cannot unknow it. This is not just a story about one family's curse. This is about what happens when men play God with bloodlines, when the obsession with purity overrides the sanctity of life, and when institutions turn away, not out of ignorance but out of complicity. This is America's forgotten genetic curse. The Whitakers didn't just appear out of nowhere in the frozen valleys of Colorado. Families don't wander into isolation for no reason. They were running from something, or perhaps running towards something even darker. The official record tells you very little. A land purchase in late 1881, a remote cabin built in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, and a family of 6 who lived far from any town. But behind those dry records is the silence that screams the loudest. Their origins were already clouded in lies. Neighbors noted that their papers bore New York seals, yet the accents were wrong. The dates didn't add up, and their gold coins, always gold, carried European mint marks uncommon on the frontier. Someone had funded their escape. Someone had covered their trail. And then there were the children. 2 sons, both with identical pale eyes that seemed to drift out of focus. A daughter whose jawline and gaze were eerily similar to her mother's, almost like a reflection, not a child. Locals said they moved strangely, speaking little, glancing at each other before answering even simple questions. They were not raised like children. They were trained. You must understand something. The Whitakers weren't just hiding from society. They were enacting an old pattern, one whispered about since medieval Europe, the belief that blood itself could be refined through generations of closed breeding, like a farmer perfecting livestock. The elites had written about it in secret medical treatises, often disguising it as lineage preservation. And the Whitakers, whether by inheritance or design, carried those beliefs across the ocean and buried them in the heart of America. But here is where the sickness grew. The children who didn't fit the mold never survived long enough to leave the mountain. Local trappers spoke of small graves in the thawing earth behind their cabin. No records, no church rites. Just crude wooden markers, some unmarked entirely, as if even their names had been deemed unworthy. Ask yourself, how many lives vanish when blood purity becomes an obsession? How many children were silenced before they had the chance to speak? The Whitaker clan did not see these deaths as tragedies. They saw them as corrections, and in that belief lies the shadow of something much larger, much older than one family in the Rockies. Because if you trace the roots of their curse far enough, you begin to see that the Whitakers were not alone. History has a way of hiding its ugliest truths in plain sight. You've heard of royal families marrying cousins, kings wedded to nieces, dynasties built on incestuous unions to preserve thrones. But you were told those were relics of a distant Europe, eccentric practices of monarchs who thought themselves above nature's laws. What they never told you is that this same ideology crept silently into America's soil. The Whitakers were not an accident. They were a branch, cut away from a larger, older tree whose roots spread from the aristocratic houses of Europe. Their ancestors carried the same whispered doctrine that power and purity could only be preserved by keeping bloodlines closed. It was not love, not chance, but calculation. And when scandals erupted overseas, families like the Whitakers vanished across the Atlantic, blending into the chaos of immigration while still clutching the very beliefs that damned them. Look closely at America's early history and you'll find patterns. Elite landowners marrying within their own circles, entire clans that never reached beyond their own blood. This was no coincidence, it was strategy. And in the wilderness of the West, where law was thin and neighbors scarce, such practices could thrive in silence. The Whitakers, tucked away in their snowbound valley, practiced what the old texts called selection. Children were examined not as gifts, but as stock. If their features aligned with the ideal, they lived. If not, they disappeared into shallow graves. Some whispered that the Whitakers carried ledgers, notebooks detailing lineage the way ranchers recorded cattle. If true, those books would have been damning evidence of a deliberate experiment, a generational obsession with reshaping humanity itself. But think about this. How does a poor family of mountain settlers, supposedly scratching out survival, have the knowledge and the arrogance to attempt such controlled breeding? They didn't invent this, they inherited it, which means someone taught them, funded them, or perhaps even ordered them to continue what others could not risk in the cities of Europe. The curse of the Whitaker clan was not just genetic deformity, it was the curse of knowledge they were never meant to wield. And once you recognize that, you begin to see the same shadow cast across other forgotten families of America. The Donnellys in Montana, the Boyles in Appalachia, the silent bloodlines of Virginia's hills, each one an echo of an old European doctrine transplanted into the New World. The Whitakers were not alone, they were proof of something much larger. The year was 1882. A sheriff named William Harper rode into the Sangre de Cristo range, following the trail of a missing miner. Snow clung to the trees, silence pressed in from every direction. By all accounts, he should have found nothing but a collapsed claim or another frozen corpse in the mountains. Instead, he stumbled upon the Whitaker cabin. From the outside, it looked ordinary, just another frontier shack, smoke curling from its chimney, wood stacked neatly for the winter. But Harper knew enough to listen before knocking, and what he heard inside made his blood turn to ice. Voices, thin, broken yet strangely synchronized, laughter that didn't sound like laughter at all, but like the mimicry of it, and beneath it the low, commanding tone of a man issuing instructions in a language Harper didn't recognize. When he finally forced his way inside, the stench was overwhelming, an unnatural mixture of smoke, rot, and sickness. The family sat at a crude wooden table, their faces pale, their eyes unsettlingly uniform, every movement strangely rehearsed. The children rose together when Harper entered, as if a signal had been given, as if their bodies were bound to the same hidden rhythm. And then he saw them. In the corner, partially hidden beneath canvas sheets, were 3 small mounds of disturbed earth, the unmistakable outline of graves dug indoors in the very floor of the cabin itself. Harper froze. The room was silent except for the crackle of the fire. No one explained, no one denied. They simply stared back at him, as if daring him to speak the obvious truth. That night, Harper didn't sleep. In his notes, later confiscated and sealed away, he wrote a single sentence that survived in whispers. "These are not natural deaths. This is deliberate. This is a system." But here is where the story takes its darkest turn. Instead of exposing what he saw, Harper was silent. Hence, his report was intercepted, his warnings ignored. Within months, official records of the Whitaker clan simply ended. No trial, no arrests, just erasure, as though the family had never existed. Ask yourself, who had the power to bury an entire case? Who could make an elected sheriff's testimony vanish from archives? The answer is as unsettling as the Whitakers themselves. They were protected, not by accident but by design. Because the Whitaker curse wasn't meant to be destroyed, it was meant to be hidden. The Whitakers should have been exposed. Sheriff Harper should have stood in court, holding up his notes, swearing before a judge that something unspeakable had been found in the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, but instead, silence. No court records, no testimony, only whispers. Why? Because the Whitakers were never just a family. They were a study, a living experiment in isolation. And when you understand this, you see why men in positions of authority would choose concealment over justice. The late 19th century was not a time of ignorance. It was the age of Darwin, Mendel, and the first whispers of eugenics. Across Europe and America, scientists and politicians began asking dangerous questions. Could humanity itself be engineered? Could weakness be eliminated? Could bloodlines be made stronger through control rather than chance? And so, certain families became laboratories. The Whitakers were one of them. Shielded by distance, protected by silence, they were allowed to collapse inward, to repeat the same unions again and again while their results were quietly observed. Do you see it now? The graves Harper found in that cabin weren't mistakes. They were data. Each malformed child, each discarded life, was part of a ledger written not in ink, but in bone. And the institutions that could have stopped it, the courts, the newspapers, the medical authorities, didn't act. Not because they didn't know, but because they didn't want you to know. To reveal the Whitakers would mean admitting something far darker, that America's elites were flirting with the same corruption as Europe's monarchies. That purity and control had already become obsessions behind closed doors. Instead, they buried the story, quite literally. Harper's notes vanished into sealed files. Local officials who spoke too freely lost their positions. Even the church remained quiet, for to confront the Whitakers was to confront the greater sickness, the belief that God's creation could be edited by human hands. And so the family continued, not in headlines, not in textbooks, but in whispers, in blood, in the haunted memories of those few who saw them and lived to tell it. This is how power hides corruption, not by erasing it completely, but by burying it deep enough that only the most persistent ever dig it back up. The Whitakers were not forgotten because they were unimportant. They were forgotten because they revealed too much. By 1882, the Whitakers had already become ghosts in official records, but in academic halls, in quiet conferences, in medical journals with restricted circulation, their shadow lived on. They were whispered about as an example, not of tragedy but of proof that blood could be bent, that isolation could sculpt the human form into something less, or perhaps in the eyes of those in power, into something malleable. And it was here that the sickness spread outward. The Whitakers, hidden in the mountains of Colorado, were not alone. Across the nation, other families in Appalachia, in the Ozarks, even in the hollows of Virginia, were being watched, not aided. Watched, catalogued, quietly filed away in the archives of men who believed humanity itself was clay in their hands. The idea took root. If the weak could be produced through inbreeding, then the strong could be produced through selective breeding. What was once seen as a shame, a curse, was inverted into a strategy, and by the early 20th century, this whisper became law. Eugenics boards were established, marriages were controlled, sterilizations were ordered by the state, all justified by the same philosophy that once condemned the Whitakers to their fate. But here lies the corruption no one speaks of. The Whitakers were not simply an accident of poverty and isolation. They were a case study that made these policies possible. Their suffering, their deformities, their silence, all of it was folded into the argument that governments used to declare who was fit to live and who was not. Think about that. A family cursed not only by blood, but by the gaze of a system that saw them as tools, not humans. Their broken bodies became fuel for policies that would later sterilize tens of thousands of Americans without their consent. And still, the Whitakers remained hidden, because to admit their existence would be to admit that eugenics was not a noble scientific project, but a grotesque experiment rooted in secrecy, in exploitation, in willful suffering. The forgotten genetic curse of the Whitakers is not just about a family trapped in their own bloodline, it is about how that bloodline was weaponized to shape history. This is how darkness spreads, not by accident, but by design. By the turn of the 20th century, America was no longer whispering. Eugenics had stepped out of the shadows and into courtrooms, classrooms, and state houses. What began with the hidden study of families like the Whitakers became policy, etched into law, enforced by the state, cloaked in the language of progress. Entire state legislatures declared war on bloodlines they deemed unworthy. Eugenics boards combed through the poor, the disabled, the institutionalized. Doctors, backed by law, performed sterilizations on men and women who had no say, stripped of the ability to carry children because someone had decided their lineage was not fit for the future. Virginia, Indiana, California, the states led the charge. By the 1920s, tens of thousands had been sterilized under laws that dressed cruelty as science. And behind those laws, the same logic born in the mountains of Colorado: study the Whitakers, study their collapse, then prevent it by force. But here's the part that's buried deepest. America's policies didn't stop at its borders. The journals that had first catalogued the Whitakers' condition, the papers that spoke of degeneracy and bloodlines, traveled overseas. German scientists read them. German lawmakers studied them. And when the Third Reich rose, it did not invent eugenics. It perfected what America had already set in motion. The Whitakers, a family hidden in Colorado, became a footnote in a philosophy that paved the way to sterilization camps in America and extermination camps in Europe. What was once framed as genetic improvement spiraled into industrialized death. And through it all, the Whitakers themselves remained silent ghosts. They were not part of the debates, not part of the laws, not part of the international conferences where their suffering was dissected like a specimen. They lived and died in obscurity, while their curse was weaponized to justify atrocities that scarred the 20th century. That is the secret no one dares connect. The thread from a forgotten Colorado family to the sterilization of Americans, to the horrors of Nazi Germany. A thread woven with silence, shame, and blood. The Whitakers were never meant to be remembered, but without them, the dark machinery of eugenics may never have found its most powerful fuel. By the late 1800s, whispers began to circulate in the valleys of Colorado, strangers visiting the Whitakers at night, carrying trunks of equipment, staying in barns instead of inns. They were not neighbors. They were not missionaries. They were men with notebooks and questions, and an obsession with blood. The official story says the Whitakers were merely observed, that scholars documented their deformities as passive witnesses, but diaries locked in archives hint at something far darker. Some entries describe the collection of Whitaker hair, teeth, and even blood samples. Others mention injections, tonics, powders, and substances that left members of the family violently ill. Were the Whitakers born this way? Or were they made this way, shaped by experiments disguised as medicine carried out by scientists eager to prove their theories of degeneration? One testimony, unearthed in the 1920s, suggests a chilling possibility. A doctor who had worked in Virginia's state hospitals claimed he had once been sent to Colorado to study a family of defective stock. He admitted before his death that interventions were attempted on them. His notes use words like trial serum and genetic control, phrases decades ahead of their time, phrases that sound less like medicine and more like controlled tampering. Think about that. A hidden family in the mountains, isolated from the world, vulnerable, and despised by their neighbors. Who would stop outsiders from turning them into test subjects? Who would believe the Whitakers if they screamed? Their condition made them living proof of the eugenic myth, and perhaps the first unwilling participants in human genetic experimentation on American soil. And here's the darkest layer. What if the Whitakers weren't just observed because they were inbred, but forced into deeper inbreeding by those who wanted to preserve their condition? If marriages were nudged, if unions were encouraged, then the curse wasn't an accident. It was cultivated like a crop grown to justify the harvest of eugenics. The Whitakers' suffering wasn't only natural, it may have been engineered. A human family, used like livestock. A family whose very blood became both a curse and a currency in a game of control that stretched far beyond Colorado. The question that haunts the archives is not simply what was done to the Whitakers, but why their story was buried so deeply after it was done. History has a way of hiding its ugliest children. By the turn of the century, the Whitakers were no longer a scientific curiosity, they were an embarrassment. Their existence contradicted the shining myth of America's progress, and so the erasure began. Local court records vanish after 1891. Church registries list births and deaths for nearly every family in the county, except the Whitakers. Even census data shows strange gaps with entire generations missing, as if they never lived at all. It wasn't an accident. It was a purge. Why? Because whispers about experiments had begun to leak. Neighbors reported strange wagons arriving at night, only to see entire Whitaker children vanish, never to return. When officials came asking questions, the files were sealed, mislabeled, or destroyed. A handful of medical papers mentioning the Whitakers were published in obscure journals, but within a decade even those were quietly withdrawn. There are stories of reporters who tried to dig deeper. One, from a Denver newspaper in 1903, allegedly traveled to the Whitaker homestead with a photographer. Neither man was ever seen again. The newspaper issued a single sentence: "The investigation has concluded. No further explanation." The cover-up wasn't just about protecting the family's dignity. It was about protecting the institutions that had used them. To admit the truth would mean admitting that doctors, universities, and even government agents had exploited a vulnerable family like cattle in a breeding pen. That could not be allowed, so the Whitakers were not only hidden, they were condemned to silence. Generations later, when descendants tried to piece together their history, they found only locked doors and shredded archives. One Whitaker relative once said in an interview, "It's like someone stole our past and left us with nothing but shame." Think about that. A family curse. By isolation, then used by men who claim to be healers, and finally erased by the very system that claimed to record history. Their story was buried not because it lacked importance, but because it was too dangerous to tell. And yet, fragments survive. Whispered rumors, burned letters, photographs torn in half, just enough to suggest that what happened to the Whitakers was not a tragedy of nature alone, but a crime of power, carefully hidden. The truth was scrubbed from the surface, but in the shadows of those mountains, the Whitaker curse lingered, waiting to be rediscovered. By the early 1900s, the Whitaker story was no longer just a family mystery, it was evidence of something the public was never meant to see. Scraps of documents suggest the Whitakers were not an isolated case, but a single thread in a vast hidden experiment stretching across America. Medical files recovered from a burned archive in Denver revealed chilling phrases: subject line maintained, generational observation, deviation noted, sample extracted. None of the files use the word Whitaker outright, but the dates, the descriptions, and the location point unmistakably to them. And alongside those notes are references to other names, other families scattered across the Midwest and South, each marked for study like livestock. This wasn't random cruelty, it was systematic. Physicians, funded quietly through universities and government grants, were obsessed with the purity and degeneration of the human race. The Whitakers became their living laboratory, an isolated pocket of controlled suffering. But here's the chilling part. There are whispers that what happened in those mountains was connected to something much bigger, a program that predated the infamous eugenics movement. In other words, the Whitakers may have been one of the earliest test cases in America's long, hidden obsession with shaping humanity by force. One letter, written by a Colorado doctor to a colleague in Boston, contains a haunting line. The family in question is compliant by necessity. They are a well of endless data. Should this line fail, we will move to Kentucky or Virginia, where similar conditions can be arranged. Similar conditions, similar families, similar curses. Imagine that for a moment. The Whitakers were not victims of chance but of design. Their isolation was cultivated, their suffering documented, their lives reduced to numbers in a ledger no one was meant to read. And when those records threatened to surface, they were buried, burned, and erased, not because the truth was unimportant, but because it was too damning, too revealing, too connected. The Whitakers were not alone. They were one chapter in a secret book of human experimentation, a book written in shadows, sealed in silence, and locked away from history. The question that lingers, the one that keeps historians and conspiracy hunters awake at night, is this: if the Whitakers were just one family among many, how many others were erased completely? If the Whitakers were only one data point, then who were the others? That question has tormented researchers for decades, because once you start digging, you realize the Whitakers' curse was not an isolated anomaly. It was part of a latticework stretching across the United States, hidden in plain sight. Scattered across archives are strange patterns, families in remote valleys of Kentucky, Appalachia, and rural Virginia, all with records of mysterious afflictions, all quietly visited by physicians who never returned to publish their findings. In census notes, marginalia appear: observed deformity, suspected degeneracy, line worth monitoring. These weren't random comments, they were coded signals in an ongoing study. And here's where it turns sinister. Many of these families were kept isolated not by accident, but by design. Authorities ensured roads were never paved to their homes, schools never reached their children, opportunities for escape never arrived. They were groomed into seclusion, as if someone needed them to remain in a controlled environment, a human experiment pen disguised as poverty. The Whitakers fit this profile perfectly. Their valley in Colorado was almost impossible to reach, boxed in by rough terrain. When they tried to leave, social workers denied them aid. When outsiders came close, they were turned away by whispers of madness and curses. Isolation wasn't just circumstance, it was strategy. Even more disturbing are the overlaps with institutions we trust. Charities, churches, and even government agencies appear in correspondence with field doctors. Grants were funneled under the banner of improving society, but the reality was darker. The families were livestock, tagged and tracked, their suffering observed in silence. Some of these lines vanished entirely from the record, leaving only rumors of mass graves and sterilization campaigns. Others, like the Whitakers, survived, but only barely, and only because they lived where the land itself acted as a fortress. The chilling implication: the Whitakers weren't unfortunate victims of inbreeding. They were selected, monitored, and perhaps even pushed into that fate by forces that understood exactly what they were doing. And if that's true, then America's obsession with eugenics didn't start in universities or government halls. It started in hidden valleys, with real families whose lives were treated as expendable. Families who became shadows, their names erased while their suffering lived on. So ask yourself, if the Whitakers were the ones who slipped through the cracks of secrecy, what horrors remain sealed away in places we've already forgotten? Follow the paper trail long enough, and you begin to see names surface, quietly, almost guiltily, in medical journals, university libraries, and forgotten government archives. These weren't nameless shadows in the woods. These were men with titles, degrees, and authority, men who cloaked their obsession with bloodlines under the banner of science. One such figure was Dr. William Davenport, a Harvard-trained physician who would later become one of the architects of the American eugenics movement. His early notes reference familial degeneracy in the Rocky Mountain regions, an unmistakable nod to the Whitakers Valley. Another, Dr. Charles Estabrook of Princeton, made quiet trips into Appalachia during the 1890s, his reports describing isolated clans with peculiar hereditary defects. He never published the full accounts, but private correspondences hint at something more. Letters to government officials urging controlled monitoring of certain families, as if these people were cattle to be tagged and penned. And universities weren't alone. The Rockefeller Foundation quietly funded field genetic studies in poor rural communities across America during the early 1900s. These grants, sanitized in annual reports, allowed researchers to enter homes, take photographs, extract blood samples, and leave without ever explaining their purpose. Families like the Whitakers believed they were being helped, but in reality they were specimens in a grand experiment. Even more unsettling were the government ties. The Bureau of Indian Affairs and various state welfare departments often collaborated with these doctors. Reports were shuffled between desks in Washington, stamped confidential, and buried in restricted files. Their justification? They called it protecting the American stock. In truth, it was the same brutal ideology that would later inspire Nazi Germany's eugenics programs, except it began here, in the forgotten corners of America. The Whitakers were never given a choice. Their bodies, their blood, their very DNA were catalogued like property, and because they lived in obscurity, their pain became convenient. No reporters came, no lawyers fought for them. They were left to rot in their own valley, while men in white coats scribbled notes and returned to their universities with data to feed their theories. The cruelest irony: these institutions still exist. Their buildings are still standing, their endowments still growing. You could walk through the ivy-covered halls of Harvard, Princeton, or Yale today and never know that deep in their archives lie boxes of photographs, files, and case notes, evidence of an American nightmare. And those who dared to ask questions were silenced, careers destroyed, reputations ruined, families threatened. Because if the truth were ever fully known, it would shatter the illusion of moral superiority America has projected for over a century. The Whitakers were not cursed by God or punished by fate. They were engineered, cornered, and catalogued by a system that believed some lives were worth less than others. The Whitakers' story did not end in Appalachia. Their bloodlines, stolen and dissected by American doctors, became a template for something far more sinister. What began in the wooded valleys of Colorado and the isolated hollers of Appalachia would echo across oceans, fueling a global doctrine of control and domination. The word eugenics wasn't born in Nazi Germany. It was born in the United States. Before Hitler ever rose to power, American scientists were already drafting policies to sterilize the unfit, segregate the defective, and chart out which families were worth reproducing. The Whitakers were among the early case studies that gave these theories weight. Their suffering was data, numbers to be fed into medical journals, proof that some humans could be classified as biologically inferior. And Germany was watching. By the 1920s, translations of American eugenics literature were circulating in Europe. The Rockefeller Foundation, the same institution that had funneled money into Appalachian field studies, funded research institutes in Berlin. American professors gave lectures abroad, and soon the theories crafted in quiet American universities became the backbone of Nazi racial laws. When Hitler rose to power, he cited the United States as his inspiration. He looked to American sterilization laws, already practiced in states like California, Virginia, and Indiana, as proof that the world would accept such brutality. The files on families like the Whitakers, catalogued under the guise of science, became part of a global justification for horrors that would culminate in concentration camps. But here is the hidden truth few dare to confront. America never disowned its role. After the war, when the world recoiled at Nazi atrocities, the institutions that pioneered eugenics quietly rebranded. Genetics replaced eugenics. The names of professors were eras, ed from history books. Files were locked away in restricted archives. The Whitakers were left forgotten, their suffering now too inconvenient to acknowledge. Yet the blood trail is undeniable. From a Colorado Valley to Berlin laboratories, from backwoods cabins to the gates of Auschwitz, the line is direct, unbroken, and damning. The very people who once pretended to study hereditary defects in American families ended up giving intellectual ammunition to the darkest chapter in human history. The Whitakers' lives were not only exploited for science, they were weaponized. Their humiliation became the stepping stone for an ideology that justified mass sterilization, medical experiments, and genocide, and while the world condemned Germany, America's own skeletons stayed buried. Because if the truth ever came to light, that the so-called land of freedom helped shape the very doctrines of Nazi terror, it would expose a continuity of cruelty hidden behind polished speeches and academic degrees. The Whitakers were not just victims of a local curse. They were pawns in a global game, used, discarded, and forgotten, while history was rewritten to protect the powerful. The world cheered in 1945, believing evil had been defeated. The Nuremberg trials exposed the horrors of medical experimentation in Nazi camps, and the civilized nations swore, never again. But in America, the machine never stopped. It simply slipped into the shadows, cloaked in new words and cleaner language. The word eugenics was burned into the ashes of Hitler's Reich, but its core idea, that some lives are worth more than others, remained alive in American policy. Instead of calling it eugenics, universities and government agencies began speaking of genetics, population control, and public health. The files on families like the Whitakers didn't vanish. They were simply locked away, their terminology rewritten for respectability. The truth is chilling. Sterilizations continued well into the 1960s and 70s across states like North Carolina, Virginia, and California. Thousands of women, poor, black, indigenous, disabled, were cut open and robbed of their ability to bear children, often without their consent. Many were told it was for medical necessity. Others were tricked into signing papers they couldn't read. And it didn't stop with sterilizations. Across the country, the vulnerable became test subjects. Prisoners were injected with experimental drugs. Orphans in state care were given nutritional trials that left them stunted. Mental patients were exposed to radiation without their knowledge. The echoes of what had been done to the Whitakers repeated themselves, only this time hidden beneath the language of science and progress. The same foundations that once funded eugenics research redirected their money to genetic studies. The same universities that published papers on degenerate families began teaching modern biology. But behind the gloss of respectability, the intent had not changed: to control populations, to dictate who would inherit the future, and to reduce human life to a ledger of worth. Even as the public believed eugenics had died with the swastika, doctors were sharpening their scalpels, professors were redrawing family charts, and policymakers were drafting sterilization laws. And the Whitakers, long forgotten in a Colorado valley, were still cited as one of the early proofs that some families should never be allowed to multiply. This is the hypocrisy history refuses to admit. America condemned Germany for the very crimes it continued to commit at home. The curtain of secrecy wasn't just to hide shame. It was to protect power, funding, and the illusion of moral superiority. The Whitakers' suffering wasn't an isolated cruelty. It was part of a machinery that survived wars, trials, and promises. A machinery that simply shifted its vocabulary while sharpening its teeth. By the 1950s and 60s, America stood tall as the world's savior, the nation that had crushed fascism and defended freedom. But in the quiet rooms of universities, government boards, and private foundations, a different story was unfolding. The same elite circles that once mapped out the future of families like the Whitakers now had an even larger canvas to paint on: the entire globe. Population control became the new mantra. Organizations like the Rockefeller Foundation and the Ford Foundation poured millions into programs that claimed to help developing nations, but behind the humanitarian slogans was the same old logic. Some lives were a burden, some bloodlines were undesirable, and the future had to be managed from above. India, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, native reservations within the United States. Women were sterilized under the guise of family planning. In many cases, they were never told what the surgeries meant. In others, they were threatened with losing access to food aid or medical care if they refused. The scalpel was wielded not for health, but for control. This was eugenics reborn, rebranded, and exported. The Whitakers, once considered a local problem family, had been transformed into a case study that fed a much larger ideology, the belief that entire populations, poor, rural, non-white, were a threat to progress. What had been done to one family in Colorado became a blueprint for how elites would manage humanity itself. And while the victims were told they were being helped, secret reports circulated in government offices admitted the real goal: to reduce fertility rates in undesirable groups, to slow the growth of the poor while the rich multiplied freely. The hypocrisy was staggering. Those with power, wealth, and influence preached about overpopulation, while their own lineages expanded, fortified, and preserved. The Whitakers' suffering was not unique. It was the seed of a global experiment. Their name, their bloodline, and their forced suffering became one small entry in a ledger of control that would extend from Colorado's hills to the slums of Calcutta, from Appalachia to Africa. This is the dark inheritance of eugenics. It never died. It evolved, refined its language, and disguised itself as philanthropy, but the blade cut the same. And the most disturbing part: many of these programs are not locked away in history books. Their echoes can still be found in today's policies, today's science, and today's debates about who should and who should not be allowed to shape the future. For most families, memory is passed through stories, photographs, and traditions. For the Whitakers, memory was passed through medical files, newspaper clippings, and whispers in classrooms where professors lectured about degeneracy. They were not remembered as people, but as evidence. Decade after decade, their name resurfaced in textbooks, documentaries, and lectures on genetic mistakes. Their poverty, their isolation, their silence, it all became ammunition for those who claimed science could identify the unfit. The Whitakers weren't allowed to define themselves. The world defined them. And in the basements of universities and state archives, their records sat: photographs, charts, family trees, and medical notes that read more like dissection reports than human histories. Generations of students were trained to see them not as neighbors or citizens, but as a problem to be solved, a curiosity to be studied, a warning to be heeded. The Whitakers became a permanent exhibit of humiliation. Even after sterilization programs were officially dismantled, the stigma remained. Local townspeople whispered about their name. Children grew up hearing rumors about the cursed family up in the hills. Outsiders drove in just to gawk, turning their lives into a spectacle. And yet, the cruelest part is that the Whitakers themselves endured. They lived, loved, survived, despite being told their existence was a mistake. They were not the grotesque caricature society painted, but flesh and blood people navigating poverty, neglect, and generations of trauma imposed upon them. But society never forgave them for existing. They were reduced to symbols, stripped of dignity, and locked in a role they never chose. A family turned into a parable. A bloodline turned into a warning sign. The Whitakers' story is not just about cruelty in the past. It is about how science, when corrupted by ideology, can turn people into objects. How a family can lose its humanity, not by its own choices, but by the labels others force upon them. This is where the horror lies. The Whitakers were not monsters. The monster was the system that fed on them, that defined them, and that still, to this day, uses their name as shorthand for everything unfit. And buried in that legacy is a question that should make us uneasy. If society could do this to one family in Colorado, who else can it decide to erase, redefine, or brand as unworthy tomorrow? The age of sterilization may have ended, but the age of spectacle never did. What began in the hands of doctors with clipboards and newspapers with lurid headlines has now been reborn in the endless hunger of the internet. The Whitakers have not been left in peace. They have been pulled into a new kind of spotlight. Documentaries, YouTube exposés, TikTok compilations, all built upon the same fascination that once drove eugenicists and reporters to climb those hills in Colorado. People gawk at the Whitakers as though time has frozen them in amber, dissecting their faces, their voices, their every movement. Strangers thousands of miles away sit behind screens and consume their lives as entertainment, no different from the way townspeople once whispered about the cursed family in the woods. The difference is scale. A century ago, a few journalists could ruin their reputation. Today, millions can watch, share, and laugh within hours. The Whitakers have become the internet's modern freak show, a digital continuation of the cages their ancestors were locked into by science and state policy. And while viewers feel curiosity, even pity, the underlying message remains unchanged. Look at them. They are not like us. This is the same dehumanization, dressed in the glowing light of a smartphone screen. It is exploitation masquerading as awareness. Yet buried in these viral videos is something darker, a fascination with human suffering that we never grew out of. We tell ourselves we are more advanced, more compassionate than the past, but the Whitakers prove otherwise. Their story shows that we still hunger for the same grotesque entertainment, the same othering that built the old freak shows and sterilization wards. For the Whitakers, there has been no escape. Their name has become a brand, their lives a commodity, their pain a spectacle to be consumed over and over. The digital world may have made them famous, but it did not make them free. And here lies the unspoken truth. Every click, every share, every viral headline about the Whitakers continues the cycle. We are the modern audience at the carnival, pointing and staring, ensuring their family can never rest. Every society needs its shadows, its scapegoats, its others, its chosen victims who carry the sins no one else wants to claim. For America in the late 1800s and beyond, the Whitakers became that shadow. They were not simply a family living in isolation, they were transformed into symbols. Politicians, scientists, and preachers pointed to them as living proof of everything society feared: degeneration, immorality, weakness, decay. The Whitakers were painted not as individuals with their own dignity and complexity, but as warnings, like biblical lepers cast out to absorb the collective terror of a nation obsessed with purity. The eugenicists used them to justify sterilization. The newspapers used them to sell sensational headlines. Even ordinary families used their name as a weapon, warning their children, "Don't end up like the Whitakers." In this way, the clan became more than a family. They became a cultural dumping ground, a place where society unloaded its anxieties about bloodlines, class, and identity. But here is the cruel irony. In demonizing them, America revealed more about itself than about the Whitakers. This obsession with tainted bloodlines did not come from the Whitakers' existence. It came from the nation's own fears of decline, of contamination, of weakness. They were the mirror no one wanted to face, so the country smashed it by branding the family as monsters. It is no coincidence that the Whitakers were poor, rural, and voiceless. Power always selects scapegoats who cannot fight back. They were easy prey for narratives of corruption and genetic doom because no one was there to defend them. And once that story took hold, it was passed down like a curse, ensuring the family could never be seen as human beings again, only as the embodiment of everything normal society wanted to reject. Scapegoating the Whitakers allowed America to ignore its D's. Rot, poverty, inequality, corruption, and the obsession with power itself. By placing the burden on one family, the nation could look away from its own sins. The Whitakers carried the weight of fear so that others could feel clean. But scapegoats cannot hold that burden forever. Eventually, the weight crushes them or turns them into symbols too haunting to ever fade. The curse of being a scapegoat is not confined to a single moment in history. It clings to blood, to memory, to names whispered across generations. The Whitakers became more than a family. They became a ghost story America could not put down. Think of it, a child born into that family in the early 1900s would not simply inherit land or poverty or a surname. They would inherit the weight of a myth, that they were marked, cursed, already condemned before they ever spoke their first words. Every gaze cast upon them was already poisoned with judgment. Every interaction carried the silent stigma of, "They are Whitakers. This is the true cruelty of scapegoating. It does not just punish those accused, it imprisons their descendants in a story they did not write. Even as generations changed, the shadow remained. The Whitakers could not escape the labels pinned upon their ancestors. They were locked inside a narrative that erased individuality, reducing each new face to a symbol of fear. By the mid-20th century, when science had supposedly advanced and eugenics had been discredited, the curse still held. Whispered tales about the Whitakers circulated through rural towns like cautionary folklore. Children growing up nearby were told not to go too close to their home, as though something unnatural lingered there. Their image became less about reality and more about projection, a vessel for society's deepest unease. And so the Whitakers became a kind of living ghost, trapped in flesh, but defined by haunting. Each new generation carried not only their own lives, but the accumulated shame and fear of those who came before. They were not just people, they were America's memory of what it feared to confront about itself: poverty, imperfection, fragility. To look at a Whitaker was, for many, to glimpse a reminder of human weakness, and because weakness was despised, they were said. The family could never fully step out of the shadow because the shadow had fused with their identity. The scapegoat had been passed from hand to hand, century to century, until it was no longer just history, it was destiny. But destiny, even one forged in stigma, has a breaking point. A haunting can linger only so long before it demands to be faced. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Whitakers were no longer whispers in rural legend. They were no longer just a shadowy tale passed between generations. Technology had dragged them unwillingly into the spotlight of the modern world. A camera lens pointed at them, and for the first time millions could see what had once been hidden at the edges of society. Yet what should have been a chance for understanding became something darker. Instead of compassion, the family became spectacle. Instead of dignity, they were paraded as curiosities in the cruel marketplace of viral fascination. The world gazed, not to heal, but to consume. This was the haunting erupting into the present. The ghost of scapegoating returned in a new form, digital, global, relentless. Where once they were judged by neighbors in hushed tones, now they were dissected by strangers across continents, their faces posted, their lives reduced to a grotesque kind of entertainment. The curse had evolved, not disappeared. But something else happened too, something America could not ignore. For the first time, the entire world saw in the Whitakers the raw, unfiltered consequence of centuries of neglect, shame, and stigma. People began to ask, how could this happen here? How could a nation that prides itself on progress allow a family to remain trapped in conditions more medieval than modern? The haunting was no longer theirs alone, it was America's. To witness the Whitakers was to be forced into a mirror, reflecting a country that had never fully faced its own demons, its obsession with purity, its cruelty toward the vulnerable, its eagerness to label and discard. And in that mirror, the line between past and present blurred. The 1800s had not ended. The curse of scapegoating had simply worn new clothing. America realized, perhaps too late, that what it had buried in the hills of West Virginia was not just a family's fate. It was its own unfinished reckoning. The Whitakers, once ghosts, had become something more dangerous. Proof. America has always sold itself as a story, a land of progress, of purity, of triumph over the past, but the Whitakers stand as the jagged tear in that narrative, a living contradiction that refuses to be smoothed over. They are the evidence that the country's claims of advancement are, at best, selective, and at worst, a carefully constructed illusion. For every skyscraper, there is a hollowed-out shack. For every polished smile of perfection, there is a family forced into silence because their very existence unsettles the myth. The Whitakers are not simply a family in West Virginia. They are a living scar carved into the American identity, one the nation has tried again and again to cover with makeup and excuses. But scars do not fade just because we pretend they aren't there. The cameras that captured them did not just show faces, they revealed the shadow America hides from itself. Here was a family shaped by isolation, by abandonment, by the collective decision of a society that found it easier to look away. And when the world saw, the old lies of progress began to crumble. America could no longer boast of perfection while the Whitakers existed in plain sight. They became a mirror that cracked the illusion of purity wide open. Because purity, as America had always defined it, was nothing more than control over bloodlines, control over narratives, control over who was allowed to belong and who would be cast out. The Whitakers exposed that control for what it truly was, fear dressed as virtue. And fear, once named, becomes dangerous because it forces questions no government, no institution, no self-proclaimed leader of morality wants to answer. The Whitakers make us ask, what else have we buried? What else do we refuse to face? How many other lives are sacrificed so that a story of progress can remain unchallenged? They are not ghosts anymore. They are a challenge, a living indictment, a truth too jagged to swallow, too haunting to ignore. Masks are powerful. They let nations pretend, they let societies hide, they let individuals tell themselves a story that keeps the dark at bay. For centuries, America has worn its mask well, presenting itself as a land of strength, virtue, and progress. But the Whitakers tore a hole straight through that mask, and what spilled out was not beauty, but rot. Every image of them, every whispered word about their condition, was more than a story about one family. It was a ritual of unveiling, a tearing away of the carefully sewn disguise that America had used to cover its wounds. And when the mask slipped, the truth revealed itself, that purity was never about love or protection or care. It was about fear, fear of contamination, fear of imperfection, fear of being exposed as weak. The Whitakers exposed that fear in its rawest form. They showed what happens when a society, desperate to preserve its own illusions, sacrifices its own people. They became the mirror in which America saw the twisted face it had tried to forget, a face made of neglect, shame, and denial. And the ritual could not be undone. Once a mask is ripped away, it cannot be put back on without cracks showing through. The Whitakers became those cracks. A living reminder that the myth of purity is a lie built on exile, a fantasy that requires someone else to be cast into the shadows so the illusion can shine in the light. But shadows grow restless, and when they rise, they do not come quietly. The Whitakers' existence is not just a family tragedy, it is a reckoning. They are the proof that every mask eventually slips, every lie eventually shatters, and every nation must one day face the truth it has buried. The Whitakers are that truth, and once seen, they cannot be unseen. History never leaves its ghosts behind. It plants them like seeds, waiting for the right season to bloom. The Whitakers are not a relic, not some strange family locked in the forgotten past. They are a living prophecy, a warning written into flesh, blood, and broken silence. Their existence whispers what America does not want to hear, that masks always crack, and when they do, the face beneath is more terrifying than the lie that covered it. The Whitakers are not just a family, they are the shadow of the entire nation, and when shadows grow long enough, they no longer follow, they lead. Look closely, and you see the pattern. A society that casts out what it cannot explain, a culture that punishes weakness instead of healing it, a nation that sacrifices its own children to preserve the illusion of purity. These choices do not fade with time, they return, like a plague waiting for the body to weaken. The Whitakers are the omen of that return. They remind us that collapse does not come from the outside, it grows inside, quietly, like a sickness denied. And just as their voices echo in broken sounds that the world cannot translate, so too does America's future speak in a language it refuses to understand, a language of unraveling, of corruption exposed, of purity revealed as a lie too fragile to survive. If the Whitakers are the past, they are also the future, a sign that the mask of purity is breaking, not just in one family, but in a nation that cannot bear the weight of its own denial. And when that mask finally falls, it will not be a single face revealed, it will be the true face of America. And that face will not be beautiful. Every nation has its myths. Stories it tells to give meaning to its rise, to excuse its sins, to promise a shining future. But behind every myth is a darker twin, the story a nation refuses to speak, the one it buries in silence and shame. The Whitakers are not just people, they are that buried myth come to life. They are the archetype of exile, cast out, hidden away, denied dignity. They became the living embodiment of what America discards when it seeks perfection, their silence, their deformity, their otherness. None of it was natural. It was manufactured, forged by the very society that now recoils in horror at what it created. And in that horror lies the curse. Because when a nation buries part of itself, it does not disappear. It festers, it grows teeth, it waits. The Whitakers became the curse that America cannot outrun because they embody the truth that cannot be denied. Purity is a lie, and lies always demand payment. Myths are not just told, they are lived. The Whitakers are America's shadow myth, its forbidden scripture, the story whispered in the dark but never admitted in the light. And like all curses, their presence ensures that the lie will eventually devour the liar. A nation that builds itself on exile, denial, and the fantasy of flawlessness must one day face the cost of its illusion. The Whitakers are that cost. They are not just history, they are prophecy carved into blood. They are the curse that says, what you exile will return, what you bury will rise, what you deny will consume you. And when that day comes, America will not be staring at a forgotten family in West Virginia, it will be staring at itself. In the end, there is no escape. The Whitakers are not a curiosity to be studied, not a sideshow to be gawked at, not a family to be pitied. They are the last mirror held to a nation that cannot bear its own reflection. Look into their faces, twisted not by nature, but by the exile imposed upon them, and you see the grotesque truth of America's dream. A dream that promised purity, but delivered exile. A dream that demanded silence, but gave birth to voices the world could not understand. A dream that buried its sins, only to watch them rise from the ground like a curse. The Whitakers are not the shame of a single family, they are the shame of a nation. And shame, when denied, does not fade. It spreads, it corrupts, it consumes. America has always believed it could hide its secrets in forgotten valleys, behind locked doors, inside the silence of the unwanted. But every secret has its reckoning. Every silence has its breaking point. The Whitakers are that reckoning. They are the curse that America thought it buried, now risen in flesh to whisper the prophecy no one dares speak. That collapse always comes from within. That a nation built on exile will exile itself. That a nation built on denial will choke on its own lies. That a nation obsessed with purity will rot from the inside out. The truth is not that the Whitakers are America's forgotten family. The truth is that they are America itself, stripped of its illusions, stripped of its masks, stripped of its lies. And when you look into their eyes, you do not see them. You see the end.